Welcome everybody, I'm Sega Lord X, and in this episode we are going to be taking a look at more Sega Saturn ports. All of these games began development on other hardware and would eventually make their way to the Sega Saturn. We're going to be taking a look at 8 games total in this episode. Let's go ahead and get started. Our first game is a game that didn't get any respect at its release, and continues to get little respect today. Night Striker was originally released in 1989 by Taito on their Z System arcade board. It's a log scaler similar to Afterburner. In this one, you have a car that can fly at will and blast enemies as they barrel towards the screen. If you've seen Galaxy Force 2 or Space Harrier style graphics, you know what to expect here. The game is fast and ultra smooth, and the 1996 Saturn version is a damn fine port of the arcade game. It had been released on the Sega CD a few years prior, but suffered a rather poor showing there. The Saturn version retained virtually everything cool about the arcade, including its kick-ass soundtrack. Seriously, these are quintessential 80s and 90s techno rock tracks here, and they sound absolutely awesome. Gameplay is repetitious, but it does change up environments and music tracks enough to keep each stage fresh and fun. This one is often overlooked by Saturn fans, and it's really a shame. Everything about this game pays homage to Sega's best from the mid-1980s, and the nostalgia trip it sends you on is great fun. It isn't the best of its kind, but I think it's the kind of game that turned out to be good, simple fun, and is extremely easy to pick up and play for 15 minutes here and there. A true hidden gem on the Sega Saturn in my opinion. Rampage World Tour would hit the Saturn in 1997. It was a port of the Midway arcade game, and the second game in the series. Featuring pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds, World Tour would follow in the steps of the original by allowing you to be one of 3 oversized monsters, destroy buildings, eat civilians, and wreak mayhem at every turn, even with a friend. The biggest difference here is the levels now scroll left and right, and are far bigger than in the original. Gameplay remains basic, with objectives being to destroy and eat as much as possible in each stage. I never cared for the look and atmosphere of this game, and pre-rendered graphics have always aged badly in my opinion. The original game looks better even with its ultra simplistic artwork. What's here isn't outright broken however, and if you have a friend with you, the game can still be good to throw on with a few beers. This one does go for a bit on eBay these days, so I'd advise looking at trying it via MAME to see if you like it first. Coming out about a year after its 16-bit counterparts, in 1996, was Earthworm Jim 2. This port would not be done by the original team, instead being done by Screaming Pink. There's a lot to like about this game. It looks and plays solid in that Aladdin kinda way for the Sega Genesis. It moves fast, is action-packed, and has unique content the 16-bit systems didn't have, like improved backgrounds and graphical effects. The problem with Earthworm Jim 2 is that the game goes for around $60 or $70 these days complete, and there simply isn't enough improved here for that kind of money. The game can be gotten for half that on the Genesis or Super Nintendo, where it plays just as well and looks nearly as good. Taken on its own merits, it's a great game, but it's a great port of a great game that's on other systems, where they're cheaper. If you're itching for platforming and shooting action on the Saturn, you can do way worse, but for this kind of money, I'd rather have a Japanese shooter or one of the Saturn's great 2D fighting games. Wipeout XL, or Wipeout 2097, would hit the Saturn in 1997 in Europe and 1998 in Japan. Based upon the PS1 version of the game, this sequel to the classic original anti-gravity racing game would see improvements in nearly every way. The graphics and drawing are better, the special effects greatly improved, and the content increased dramatically. The incredible soundtrack from the PS1 would see big changes here, but with no less impact in terms of quality. Much like the first Wipeout, this port would see major drawbacks when pitted against the PS1 game. First, texture quality and frame rate would both take a hit, as would transparency effects. When sat side by side, these differences would be stark, painting the Saturn in bad light in terms of 3D ports yet again. This isn't a bad game, however. It's just a weaker version of an incredible game. The Japanese version of the game is going up in price considerably, which is why I have the European release you see here. Unfortunately, that means a slightly cut off screen at the bottom. If you can live with that, the European version tends to be quite inexpensive, and if you liked Wipeout on the Saturn, you should love this one even more. Mega Man X3 made its way on the Saturn closely following the Super Nintendo release in 1996. This nearly one-to-one port is as bare bones as they come. Anime cutscenes were added to enhance the experience, but did little more than add load times and ugly full-motion video. The core game is Mega Man X through and through, and while not bad in its day, had begun to grow a bit stale by this release. The inclusion of other playable characters did help the game along, and I really appreciated the fantastic soundtrack in this one. It isn't a bad game by any means, it's just that it really doesn't show off much of the Saturn's hardware in any meaningful way. It's a 16-bit game in both look and design, making it hard to recommend. On the plus side, the Saturn version isn't terribly expensive even now, so it's one of the Saturn's more accessible 2D games. The US version would never see a release, making the European version the only English version available. Originally developed for the Atari Jaguar of all things, Rayman would land on the Saturn shortly after in 1995. One of the very first examples of 32-bit power, Rayman was exquisitely detailed and colorful, loaded with great animations and a fun, upbeat soundtrack. Gameplay was simple platform mechanics of jump and attack, but level design always remained fun and challenging. This was one of the first Western releases on the Saturn I actually was impressed with, as most devs, even the ones releasing 2D games, always seem to get something wrong in the move to Sega's machine. I credit Ubisoft with a spot-on, excellent port of this game, and it's definitely worth owning. The game still looks great today, but the slower platform mechanics of that era do rear its ugly head in sections. The game is also going up in price as of late, eclipsing $50 fairly regularly now. If the price doesn't scare you away, Rayman is a great 32-bit platformer that holds up extremely well. Norse by Northwest, The Return of the Lost Vikings, is a port of the 16-bit Super Nintendo original, The Lost Vikings 2. This version would see an upgrade, and I use the term loosely, to pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds. The original Super Nintendo version used traditional sprite and background work that has held up remarkably well today, while this pre-rendered garbage has aged poorly as usual. But with all that said, this game is still highly playable and quite fun. The boss from the first game has returned to mess with our Viking trio yet again, and sure enough, before you know it, you're lost and trying to find your way home. You control a 3-man Viking team with various skills and attributes to traverse countless hazards in an effort to complete levels of varying themes. Stage design is puzzle heavy, and each area relies heavily on using your attributes to overcome the obstacles. Some areas provide further enhancements to your team, adding quite a bit of challenge to later levels. Norse by Northwest isn't a terribly expensive game in the US, and is definitely worth a look, if nothing else for its unique gameplay style. Blizzard always made really good games, even way back then.
To select an item for use, press Z, then move the
Tenpin Alley has the dubious honor of being one of the worst Saturn ports I've ever had the displeasure of covering. The game looks just awful in just about every single way. Terrible textures, poor clipping, dubious models and animation, you name it, and Tenpin Alley gets it wrong. Side by side its PS1 counterpart, it looks a generation away, and the PS1 wasn't a looker itself. This was obviously a quick and dirty port, done to try and cash in on the Saturn market that lacked games of this type. Despite being so incredibly ugly, the game does play a decent game of bowling. The pendulum system adds quite a bit of challenge, and your turn never guarantees a strike or a spare. In fact, the game can be downright difficult at times. It shines in its multiplayer mode, and can be a blast when not taken seriously. The lack of suitably themed lanes, any kind of lighting or special effects, and the ho-hum soundtrack really hurt the presentation. But considering the game is fairly inexpensive, and the Saturn lacks this genre on a whole, it isn't a bad game overall. The gameplay does take some effort, but grab a friend and you're good to go. So, 8 more games for the Sega Saturn. Some of those games are actually pretty damn good, and even the ones that fell on the lower end of that scale were still playable. One of the things that has really interested me about the Saturn is the ports that the system received. You see, the system was never ever judged for its exclusives. If the Saturn had only been known for those Sega Saturn Model 2 ports and its 2D exclusives, the Saturn would have been a popular system. It was the ports from other hardware that would go on to absolutely define the Sega Saturn in its time. Most of that negative hype, most of that bad press that would come from these ports as being inferior and not looking as good, not playing as good, not sounding as good, that would actually go on to define the Sega Saturn at the time. It's so interesting too to see the varying quality between some of these ports, where some of these ports are really good and some of them are really bad. There's a whole lot more ports that came to the system, a whole lot more games in this particular category to cover, but these 8 I felt we would take a look at this time. I'm Sega Lord X, let's do this again soon, and I'll catch you next time.